In the year 1251, a clerk working for the Bishop of Ely sat down with a quill, a pot of iron gall ink, and a sheet of vellum, and he wrote a contract. Not with the people bound by it, not for their benefit. He wrote it for the bishop's accountants, so they would know exactly how much human life each acre was entitled to consume. A half-frigate tenant at Wisbech, that is, a man farming roughly 15 acres of heavy fenland soil, owed 3 days of labor every week on the bishop's fields. He would plow when told to plow. He would sow when told to sow. He would cart manure, dig ditches, mend fences. For this he received nothing. No wage, no share of the crop. At Easter, he owed 5 eggs. At Christmas, 1 hen. During harvest, he and his household came to the bishop's fields and worked until the reeve dismissed them. The clerk wrote all of this in neat Latin columns, the language of institutional control, and when he was finished, he had produced something that reads today less like a tenancy agreement and more like an inventory of a man reduced to his outputs. That document survived. It is in an archive now, and you can read it. And if you do, you will notice something. The clerk never recorded the tenant's name. What you are about to hear is the story of a system that turned millions of English men, women, and children into legal extensions of the soil they were born on. Not through a single dramatic act of enslavement, but through dozens of small, itemized, enforceable claims on every piece of their productive lives. A system where your labor, your grain, your animals, your daughter's marriage, and your own death were all revenue events for someone who owned the land beneath your feet. And the question this story arrives at is not whether that system was cruel. The records have already settled that. The question is whether you recognize the math. To understand what bound a medieval English peasant, you have to understand a single legal word: villain. After the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror redistributed virtually all English land to roughly 200 of his followers. They parceled it downward. Within a generation, England was a patchwork of manors, and on those manors, the majority of the population, perhaps 70 to 75%, held their land not by ownership but by custom. They were villains, and villeinage was not poverty. Poverty was its consequence. Villeinage was a legal status, inherited at birth, attached to a specific piece of land, and it meant one thing above all else. You could not leave, not without permission, not without paying a fee. And if you ran, the Lord had a year and a day to find you and drag you back. Your children would be born into the same status, their children after them. This was not employment. No one applied. No one negotiated terms. You were born inside a contract you never signed, on land you would never own, and the terms were written on vellum you would never read, in a language you did not speak. Now picture the week. You rise before dawn in a single-room cottage, timber frame, wattle and daub walls, a thatched roof with no chimney, smoke from the central hearth drifting upward through the straw and settling into everything you own. The floor is beaten earth. Your animals, a cow, a few chickens, share the far end of the room. The air smells of wood smoke and dung and damp wool. 3 days of this week, you walk to the Lord's domain, the portion of the manor farmed directly for his profit, and you work. The bailiff tells you what to do. Plow the heavy clay with a team of oxen you may have partly contributed. Sow seed you will never eat. Weed rows you will never harvest. You do this in rain, in cold, in the mud of an English fenland winter, and at the end of the day, you walk home to tend your own strips of land in whatever light remains. Those strips, scattered across the open fields in narrow ribbons roughly 220 yards long, are where you grow the food that keeps your family alive. 3 days for the Lord, the remaining days for yourself. Except it was never really the remaining days, was it? Because the obligations did not stop at week work. At harvest, the weeks when every stalk of grain matters, the Lord called in what the documents term boon works, also known with a kind of institutional poetry that deserves to be studied as love boons. The word love here had no more emotional content than it does in a modern contract's in consideration of. During harvest, your 3 days might become 5, 6, and not just you, your wife, your older children. Anyone in your household capable of cutting grain with a sickle and binding it into sheaves. The custumel of the abbot of Ramsay's Manors specifies that at harvest, the villain must come with all his household except his wife. Other estates demanded her too. In return, the Lord provided food, dark bread, weak ale, sometimes a dish of beans. The quality of this food was itself a source of recorded complaint, the kind of grievance that surfaces in court rolls because even within a coercive system, people fought over the details of their coercion. Refusal was not an option. Refusal was punishable. The love boon was compulsory, and the word love was a legal fiction, dressed in the language of voluntary generosity. And then there was the mill. You grew the grain. You harvested the grain. You carted it to the Lord's mill, and there you paid multure, a fee of roughly 1/16 to 1/13 of the grain for the privilege of having it ground into flour so you could bake bread for your family. You could not grind it yourself. The Lord held suit of mill, a monopoly on grain processing, and it was enforced with a pettiness that tells you everything about where power actually lived in this system. At the manor of St. Albans in 1331, the tenants had been grinding their own grain in secret, using hand querns, flat circular stones about 18 inches across, simple enough for a woman to operate in her own cottage. Abbot Richard de Wallingford found out. He sent his men to confiscate every hand quern in the village. They broke the stones, and according to the Chronicle of Thomas Walsingham, a monk writing at St. Albans, a few decades later, the abbot had the fragments set into the floor of the abbey parlor, a mosaic of crushed domestic autonomy walked over daily by the men who had ordered it destroyed. You ground your own food in your own home, and that was a crime. Sit with that for a moment. But the system's true genius, if that is the word, was not in any single obligation. It was in the accumulation. Because a villain did not simply owe labor and multure. A villain owed at every turn of life, at every transition, at every vulnerability. Consider the Harriet. When a villain died, the Lord was entitled to the family's best beast. Not money, not a percentage. The actual animal, the best ox, the strongest cow. The family loses its breadwinner and, before the body is in the ground, loses the animal that plows the strips, that grow the food that keeps the remaining family alive. The pipe rolls of the Bishop of Winchester's estates record these transactions with meticulous indifference. In Taunton, 1248, a widow surrenders 1 ox as Harriet and then immediately petitions the court for permission to take over her dead husband's tenancy. Permission that required another payment, an entry fine. She paid to lose her ox, and then she paid to keep farming the land her husband had already paid to farm. The Harriet was not an accident of custom. It was a mechanism, and its function was precise. Prevent villain families from accumulating capital across generations. Your father built something modest. He dies. The Lord takes the best of it. You start from less than he did. Consider the merchant. Your daughter wants to marry. If the man is from outside the manor, you owe the Lord a fine. because your daughter's future children would be born as villains on another lord's land, and your lord has just lost a generation of labor. The scholar Eleanor Searle argued in 1979 that the merchet represents something stark: seigneurial control over women's reproductive capacity. The lord had a direct economic interest in where a villain woman's children would be born. Her marriage was not a family matter. It was a resource allocation decision, and the lord held what amounted to veto power. Consider tallage, an arbitrary tax the lord could levy on villains at will. No fixed rate, no schedule, no appeal. The legal term for a villain's rights in the face of tallage was, effectively, none. Custom and the practical risk of provoking mass resistance constrained it, but the legal right was unlimited. Consider amercements, fines levied in manorial court for offenses that ranged from the genuine to the absurd. Letting your animals stray onto the lord's land, failing to maintain a ditch, brewing ale without a license, gleaning grain in unapproved ways after harvest. The historian Zvi Razi, studying the court rolls of Heilsauer Manor across a century, found families appearing as defendants multiple times per year, accumulating fines that functioned as a steady, grinding drain on household resources. Consider chauffage. If you somehow obtained permission to live temporarily outside the manor, to work in a nearby town, you owed an annual fee for the privilege of not being where you were legally required to be. You paid for the right to be absent from your own unfreedom. Consider pannage, a fee for your pigs to forage in the lord's woodland. Entry fines when a son inherited his father's holding. Payments of eggs and chickens at Christmas and Easter. Carrying services to transport the lord's produce to market. Every obligation individually small, collectively relentless. Now stack them. 3 days of unpaid labor per week. Boon work during harvest, demanding your entire household. Multure on every bushel of grain. Harriet when you die. Merchet when your daughter marries. Tallage whenever the lord decides. Amercements for any infraction real or invented. Chauffage if you leave. Pannage for your pigs. Entry fines for your children. Historians who have tried to calculate the total, scholars like Bruce Campbell, working through the agricultural economics of 13th century domain farming, arrive at estimates that are difficult to state without sounding polemical. On a heavily burdened manor, a villain surrendering 3 days of week work was already giving roughly half of available labor time to the lord. Add everything else, and the total extraction plausibly exceeded 50% of productive output. On the most aggressively managed ecclesiastical estates, it may have approached or exceeded 60%. No single medieval document states this number. But every single obligation is documented, and the arithmetic is not complicated. If you are thinking that this sounds less like tenancy and more like a system designed to capture everything above bare survival, you are reading it the way the people inside it eventually read it too. There was one escape, one crack in the wall. If a villain fled the manor and reached a chartered borough, a town with legal freedoms granted by royal charter, and lived there for a year and a day without being found and returned, they gained legal freedom. The German phrase for this principle has survived into common knowledge. Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes free. A year and a day. 366 days of hiding in a town, working, avoiding detection, knowing that if the Lord's agents found you on day 365, you went back. Freedom was not a right. It was a countdown. And then consider what the poet saw. William Langland, writing around 1377, composed Piers Plowman, an allegorical poem that is also, in its best passages, a piece of documentary witness. Langland describes a plowman working in cold rain. His wife sits beside him in the field, an infant in her arms. His children cry from hunger. This is not allegory. This is what the system looked like at ground level, and Langland, writing in the generation before the system cracked open, set it down in English verse because someone had to. In June of 1381, they said no, not individually, not by fleeing one at a time toward the boroughs, collectively. Tens of thousands of agricultural laborers, men who had spent their lives bound to land, paying with labor and grain and animals and daughters' marriages, marched on London. They carried billhooks and axes and staves, the tools of their own extraction repurposed as weapons. Their leader was a man named Wat Tyler. Their intellectual voice was a priest named John Ball, who asked the question that shook the manorial system to its foundations. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? At Mile End, the rebels presented their demands to the young king, Richard II. They asked for the abolition of serfdom. They asked for the right to rent land at a fixed rate of 4 pence per acre. They asked for the freedom to buy and sell in open markets. Read that list again. Freedom from inherited bondage, fair rent, the right to participate in commerce. These demands are so modest, they describe what you would consider the bare minimum of economic personhood. They were denied. Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations. The revolt was crushed. The king's promises were revoked, and the manorial courts went back to recording amercements and collecting Harriets. But the system was already dying, and what killed it was not revolution. It was death on a scale that rearranged the mathematics of power. The Black Death, arriving in 1348, killed roughly 40 to 60% of England's population in 2 years. Suddenly, there were not enough hands to work the fields. Surviving villains could demand wages, could threaten to leave, could find lords desperate enough to offer better terms. Parliament tried to freeze the old order in place with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, fixing wages and restricting movement. It failed. You cannot legislate away a labor shortage. Over the next century, villeinage bled out, not from a single wound, but from 1,000 negotiations in which surviving peasants had, for the first time, something the system had always denied them. Leverage. By the late 15th century, villeinage had effectively disappeared from English law, not because anyone declared it unjust, because it became unenforceable. I want to leave you with this. The Custumal of the Bishop of Ely is in an archive. You could, in principle, go read it. It is written in Latin, in a clerk's careful hand, and it lists everything a man owed for the right to exist on land he was born on. 3 days of labor, 5 eggs, 1 hen, his best ox when he died, his daughter's autonomy when she married, his grain processed only on terms he did not set, his freedom of movement available only for a fee, his children's future identical to his past. The system did not call itself extraction, it called itself custom. It called itself obligation. It called its harvest labor a love boon. If you have read this far, you already know the question the title asks: whether the math of how much of a working life belongs to someone else has changed as much as the vocabulary. That is not a question the historical record can answer for you. The historical record can only show you that in 1251, a clerk itemized a man's entire productive existence on a single sheet of vellum, and that the man whose life was catalogued there was never asked and never named. The parchment survived. The man did not. If you have been watching this channel, you know we return to the records, the documents, the court rolls, the charters that outlasted the people they governed. Next time, we go inside a different archive. If that matters to you, subscribe, and we will be here.